Hello, everybody, and welcome to the new episode of Fullfunnel B2B Marketing Live podcast. Meet your host, Andrei Zinkovic, and my guest, Erin Balsa. As you know, we run this live podcast for our community called Trenches, where you guys all can join the episode. You can jump in, ask your questions, and all your questions will be covered. And we bring you top-notch experts like Erin. Today we are going to chat about building content marketing teams for B2B companies with high ACV. Why? Because if you'll take a look at content marketing space, right, you'll see lots of case studies, lots of examples that are mostly coming from marketing agencies, from low-ticket SaaS products, right? Maybe from e-commerce or D2C space, but you'll rarely see good examples of content case studies, of content strategies shared by companies that are selling high-ticket product, right? Maybe you can find companies like Terminus, like Demandbase in our MarTech space, but if we'll move away from MarTech, you'll rarely find a good example. So I believe Erin is the best person to talk about this, and for you who didn't follow Erin, she was a marketing director at the Predictive Index, and now she works as a founder and how she calls herself chief picky editor at Erin Balsa Content Marketing. So for you guys who are looking for fractional chief content officer, you know who you should reach out. So today we are going to chat about building B2B content marketing team, developing B2B content strategy, right? And developing this B2B content engine. Meet Erin. Erin, thanks a lot for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on this conversation. And thank you everybody for showing up to listen. I don't know that I am the best, but I really appreciate your faith in me. I will share what I've learned so far and hopefully it's helpful.
So for you guys, as always, you can ask your questions in a Zoom chat. If you want to jump in and ask your question live, just let me know and I will call you and you'll be able to join the conversation. And I would like to start our convo with one simple question, right? Let's pretend I'm working at a B2B tech company, B2B SaaS, let's make it precise, right? Non-MarTech, non-sales space. So I don't have a content team at all. I rely on outbound activities, right? And I understand that it's the right time to start demand generation and basically develop the content engine. So the question is, what should be the minimal viable content team? What roles and functions you'll need in the beginning?
That's a great question. And I want to give a little bit of context. So I started off at a marketing agency, writing for very small SMBs up to, global blue chip companies. So I do have, that diversity of experience. So when I'm thinking through this, I'm thinking also of the companies I've worked with in the past that are like big manufacturing type technology companies and industries that aren't necessarily super hip and fun. I'm not talking about writing fun content for a company like Gong. I'm talking about a high ACV offer and, a company that, like you said, has been very successful thus far through outbound, and they just don't know where to begin with, scaling and adding that content arm. So I always think that you can think about format, you can think video or a blog or whatever else is going to be, ebooks, there's so many different things you could do, a podcast. But at the heart of all of that is words. So the most important competency for me is writing. You need to have a strong message. And I would start with making sure that your message is strong in that you have strong brand positioning, a strong documented brand narrative that shows how you're differentiated from the other players in the space within your space and your category. So that to me comes before you even bring on, an in-house writer. So I'd make sure that I had that down. And then the first person I would hire for my content team is someone who not only can write well, but someone who can edit. And when I say edit, I don't mean line editing. We don't need that anymore. We have Grammarly and Hemingway Editor and all these great AI tools that can easily pick up a quick mistake. We need people who are developmental editors. So they're going to look at a content piece submitted by a freelance writer, and they're going to dive in and say, what do you mean by this? This, needs to be explained. We need an example. Where did you find this? Where did you find this statistic? You need to cite the original source. You need someone who can really restructure the flow of a story and show areas that need to be revised and be made more clear. And you need somebody who can always keep the brand voice on the forefront, as well as the brand narrative and the positioning within the market. So I need someone who's pretty experienced. I wouldn't just hire, a newbie with 1 year of writing and editing experience, because they probably don't quite understand the full picture yet. So I would probably invest in someone with at least 3 to 5 years experience who can write, edit, assign, and build from there.
May I ask you a question? So would you say this person should have all the skill set, right? So all the skills and wear multiple hats, or this should be 2 different people?
I think that the first hire needs to have those skill sets. They need to know how to developmentally edit. They need to know how to assign. They need to know some basic go-to workflows that they can use to onboard freelancers, to, just get that whole engine ripping and roaring. And another thing that's really important that usually someone new doesn't necessarily know how to do is to harvest all of the knowledge from subject matter experts within the company and subject matter experts that are partners of the company. They need to know how to harvest that in a scalable way. So somebody that can come in and set up really basic processes for content ideation, content requests, content repurposing, things like that. So, you could have someone come in and start assigning random topics to freelancers, and you can get content out there, but is it really going to be that type of thought leadership and really advanced content that's going to get people who are going to be purchasing these high ACV offers interested? You want them to lean forward, take interest, and listen. And so that requires a lot of collaboration. It's not going to be content just from a writer's head. It has to really be harvesting knowledge from the subject matter experts internally and externally.
Absolutely. I believe that's the most important part, right? If you don't have a subject matter expert, how are you going to provide an expert content? Potentially, what you can do is do kind of content collaboration and collect insights from industry thought leaders, your customers, right? Your target market, but then you won't say you can provide it as a research, right? Something that you are very experienced. And by the way, guys, Erin would be a speaker at our upcoming Fullfunnel Summit. I will send you a link where you can get a free ticket for the summit. And on summit, we'll cover the exact market research process. But today, let's focus on this one. One practical question. Actually, one of our clients asked this question. So what if the only one subject matter expert is in-house CFO, but this person is extremely busy, right? So what would be the best way to harvest the insights from that person, and how to present this new content strategy and the importance of insights from that person? And what would be the best way to collaborate? Basically ask to, I don't know, record an audio, right, and share some insights, and then content writer will pick it up. Or what would be the best way to involve that subject matter expert?
Yeah, that's a difficult situation. You have one subject matter expert who's in such high demand as the CFO or another senior leader. I would try to make the best use of their time in that, if you're having that person speak at an industry event, or maybe you're having them be a speaker on a podcast or webinar or something like that, I would definitely repurpose all of that content and get as much mileage out of it as I could. So those are really important things that are worth that person's time, right? Speaking at an industry conference, And if you're there and you're recording it and you're transcribing it, that should provide fodder for content for the next month. So I'd really try to start there. How can you dig into what that person's already doing and get the most content out of that? Then if they're willing to give some more time, I would try to make it easy for them. Are they driving at 5 p.m. every day to pick up their kids from soccer? Maybe they don't mind dialing in from their phone and you're gonna interview them while they're driving. They're not wasting any time because they're just in the car anyway. So really trying to accommodate them and make it really easy for them to help you.
Cool. Thank you so much. Also, Moni asked a question. You mentioned when we spoke about a person that can write the content and being an editor at the same time, right? So he asked, so the editor will edit the content that he wrote himself, or you were talking about onboarding freelancer?
So someone who's a really strong editor and writer can edit their own content if they're really good, but I would always tell them to, when they're starting especially, get it reviewed by a subject matter expert, a product marketer who knows the product inside and out. That's important. The longer somebody's at the company, the more they just know how to do it, and they can probably put it up and it'll be fine. But yeah, I really mean someone who can assign to others and get that content in the best shape.
And also one more question coming from Jamila. How much should you pay that person? Is it like a kind of range for that role in this specific industry?
It depends, of course, where the person's located. Cost of living is a huge factor. It depends on who your competitors are. And if you really truly want to get the top talent, you're going to have to be willing to pay. I can give you estimates on what I see in different groups I belong to, all the best jobs that get posted. I would say right now, if you want someone with 5 years of experience who has some deep experience with this stuff, and you want to get someone really, really good, I'd be looking at like 130 and up, 130 to maybe 180 with a package. If you want someone who's going to manage a team, build a team, help you with your positioning and messaging, build processes, set up some really strong, scalable content operations, that's somebody that's worth the money. Because if they come in, they build you a content strategy to start, they help you, create the right content, they create a research report that ends up resulting in 5 sales. And if you have a ticket that's 100K, you're making 500K off of one report that person's giving you. So I would say bare minimum to get someone good would be like 130 and up. And then the more experience they have, the more results they have, the more that you're going to need to pay them, because honestly, they could go out on their own and make double that. So if you want them in-house, you really got to treat them good.
So that basically leads me to the next question. How can you identify a great writer? How can you find a great writer and hire? If
you are a reader of industry publications and there's an article that makes you kind of lean forward and tilt your head, kind of like an interested puppy, gets you curious, look at who wrote it, look them up, see if that person is open to coming in-house. There's a lot of people who are really talented and bright, and they go out on their own, and then they decide that they wish they did have a team. They do want to contribute to one organization's growth. It doesn't hurt to reach out, be like, hey, I read this article, it really caught my attention. Hey, you're finding them, and you're not just blanket reaching out. There's so many people that blanket reach out to like 100 and they just hope for the best. That's not necessarily a great strategy. So I'd probably start by thinking through articles within your industry specifically that really got you to sit up and pay attention, and then start reaching out to those people. That doesn't work and you have a hard time, I would start asking in communities. Who have you worked with in the past? Who do you wish you could hire? And then do your best to try to entice that person to leave, because it can be done. I've seen it. I've seen so many people at these great companies and I think, oh, they've only been there for a year. They'd be great for this role, but they're probably not going to leave. And then guess what? A week later, they leave because they got a really enticing offer. So never be afraid to go after those people that you really want, and go after them hard. You got to sell those people.
But if you, let's say, if your market is conservative, right, niche one, there are no communities basically, would you go to an association and ask them? Would be a good approach? What do you think?
Yeah, when I think of associations, those are communities. So whatever community it is that you have access to and that you belong to, start there. And I'm sure that somebody will have recommendations for you.
And let's look at this from another angle. So you basically, you try to reach out, or you either don't have budget to hire these people, right? You don't have that money they want. And basically what you can do is just post a job, right? Post a job offer and try to find some candidates. So if you are going to get these random applications, how would you evaluate these people? Because I believe CV won't give you a good idea, right? If it's a good writer or no. Basically, of course, you can ask to share some of the best pieces of the content, but again, it won't give you a full overview of the skill set. Let's say if it's a young content marketer, right, and he or she worked maybe for 1, for 2 companies, and basically they created content according to the policy and guidelines of that company, right? So would you just evaluate them based on their pieces of content, or you give them a test tasks? What is your approach?
First, I would argue that if you don't have the budget to hire someone good, reevaluate your budget, because I guarantee you're burning money somewhere that you could borrow from and put it into content. And your message is like the most important thing other than, your product. Your brand and your message is everything. So that's just what I would say first. I would try to get that extra budget. It's going to make your life easier in the long run. That said, if you're trying and you're unable to do that, I wouldn't hire anybody without giving them a writing test. And the reason is, as someone who's been editing for 10 years, a lot of times, if you hire somebody for a freelance article based on what you see in their portfolio, and then you get their unedited copy, as an editor, you're like, wow, this is not what I expected. This looks nothing like the samples you showed me in your writing portfolio. And that's because whenever you see a writing sample, it's been edited, sometimes heavily, by someone very good. So I personally do not hire for a full-time role without giving a writing test. If I'm hiring a freelancer, I'm not going to give them a test. I'm going to pay them to write like an article, a very low risk project. And, it's really no sweat off my back if I pay them $150 for a short article and it's not amazing. I'm just not going to hire them again. But if I'm hiring for a full-time role, I for sure give them a writing test. And there's 2 rules for writing tests. Number 1, if the test is going to be something you could ever possibly post, like if you want to test them about your industry in specific or your product, you need to pay them for their time. There's no laws, it's just best practice. You don't want to leave a poor taste in someone's mouth. You don't want to damage your brand reputation, and you just want to respect that person's time, because any time they're spending on your tests, they could have been spending pitching clients or making money. And you really don't want to abuse an industry, a profession that does tend to get abused. So treat your writers well. And other than that, if you're not allowed to pay somebody, say it's a company policy, I have experienced this. There are some companies who will not pay for any skill tests in any role. In that case, there's a rule that I follow. I time the test to be 30 minutes, and I ask them to write about something that speaks to my audience, but it's nothing that my company would ever publish. So for example, write an article speaking to a C-level HR leader about your favorite website. So obviously I'm not going to ever publish that, but it's going to show me their unedited writing talent and if they understand what kind of language that audience would want to be spoken to in. And the reason that I time it is to respect their time. And I tell them that in the assignment. So this isn't an exercise in writing fast. I'm not going to judge you if you don't finish a whole article in 30 minutes. I just want to respect your time, because I know in the past, when I was younger in my career, I did writing tests and I spent a whole freaking day, 8 hours on a writing test, and candidates will do that if they really want the job, and that's not cool. So I really believe in trying to minimize their time or pay them.
Cool. And one practical question. So would you, like, let's say I'm thinking about the key evaluation factor. Would you look first of all on their workflow? So basically, do they do the research where they try to find the information? Would they ask you a question like, can you give me access to subject matter expert, right? These sorts of questions. Or would you look on, let's say, wording, right? What, like, how do they structure sentences, etc. So what should be the core evaluation factor?
It depends on what role you're hiring for. Is this your head of content, this initial hire? I would expect them to have some questions. I would expect them to be treating you and this assignment like they would be treating any assignment if they were already working in the role, or like they'd be treating an assignment from a new client that they were contracting with. So I would expect to see some questions like that. If I'm hiring a more junior writer, I'm not going to expect them to ask any questions. And if they don't, that's okay. I think that they would grow those skills over time as they evolve in their career. So that wouldn't be like a red flag for me if they didn't ask any questions. They could still end up being a great employee and a great writer.
Thank you. So I see lots of questions in the Zoom chat. Let's bring our community. Daniela, please go ahead. I will, just unmute yourself and switch on your camera.
Hi, so I had a question going back to what you said, Erin, about starting before churning out content, starting with a brand narrative, that product documentation, all that to lead what you're going to write. And I'm curious how you balance the need for, we don't have that product marketer yet. We don't have a fully fleshed out brand narrative. We have some of it done, but it's not final. How to balance that with the pressure from leadership to get content out there and thought leadership out there and start ranking for organic search. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think that especially when you're early on and you're an early stage company, you're not even always going to have product market fit. So how can you have a really strong narrative if you're not quite sure? So that message that you've started to formulate, get that out there, see how it sticks. That's going to help you evolve your narrative over time. And then, have a plan for every 6 months or every year to go back out and do that market research, speak to people and try to evolve your narrative as you're learning, as you're conducting win-loss interviews, as you're trying to understand really what it is about your product that people value. It might not be what you initially thought that they would value. When you're starting to find out exactly which people are the buyers and the influencers, it might not be what you originally thought. So that narrative is going to be a living, breathing documentation, just like a content strategy. So I'd say that go with what you have and keep iterating on it over time on like a 6 or 12-month cadence.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Russell, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having this. My question comes from a kind of content manager, content director perspective of coming into a new in-house B2B role where there's a big heavy push as always for organic traffic and high funnel, high keyword traffic, but also kind of an equally heavy ask for big content, things that can be downloaded, promoted, and also a lot of that foundational stuff around mission and brand and personas. So what's your, when you're being kind of measured against a lot of those things, what's your perspective on balancing those?
Wow, you just described my life for like the last several years. So I try to think about content in terms of buckets, and they funnel down from the organizational goals. So when I'm thinking about what I need to be creating, I'm going to say, does that map directly to one of our primary company goals? Okay, it does. Cool. Does that also map directly to one of our major marketing goals for the year? And if so, that's going to get a percentage of my team's resource. So I have a resourcing model. It's like a simple 2x2 Eisenhower matrix, and I'll evaluate all content requests and content ideas within that framework. So I'll say, okay, first of all, is this going to be high impact or low impact? So you're talking about those big content pieces, those are going to be high impact, but is it going to be high effort or low effort? Those are going to be high effort. So I'm going to have my percentage of work that's going to map to each of these company goals. And then from there, I'm going to assign based on the effort and the impact. And that's kind of how I prioritize my content. So I probably would do it all in differing amounts based on those factors.
Very cool. Thank you. That sounds like a whole nother webinar topic too. I'm excited.
Thank you. Vincent, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so hey, great talk. And I'm wondering how to make podcasts and webinars fit in with an SEO strategy to not make it bland content, because a lot of the SEO content that gets out there is very bland listicle style. And I'm wondering how to integrate the SME time on webinars and podcasts with creating good content for search, and whether you go into it with a content briefing or questions at your side, or if you take it on a free spin and search for search opportunities later on and try to find a strategy there.
This is another thing that's rooted in the content strategy. So one of the first things that I do when I'm working with a new company is come up with their content pillars or buckets. And if you think of these would be the category names on a blog, but these extend far beyond the blog. They are typically things that ultimately roll up into your product capabilities. And that's kind of how I think of content ideation. So one part of the strategy for me is coming up with content clusters that funnel down from the pillars. So let's pretend one of my pillars is content, and I'm going to think of all the possible buckets that could funnel down from content. And then I'm going to think of those in terms of funnel. Are those top of funnel? What kind of questions do people have? Are those more middle of funnel? And I'm going to build out this kind of content mapping plan so that when I'm coming up with a topic for a webinar, it's always going to fall into one of those buckets. And I'm not as worried about SEO initially, because I know that once these conversations come out of the webinar, I can easily look at my content mapping plan and I can see which areas I'm weak in. Like, oh, I really don't have a lot of content about, this middle of funnel search term here. So I'm going to make a webinar about that topic, and I'm going to write really great content and make sure that I'm using some of those related cluster keywords. And that's how I would approach that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's cover one more question from Lauren. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Erin.
Hi.
I have a question around just sort of like as a content lead who is building out a content team for the first time. I'm sort of struggling with like how to put like systematic processes in place for scaling a team and producing like a larger amount of content like at scale. So I'm just wondering if you, beyond just like, obviously we need a content calendar, that sort of stuff. Just wondering if you have any tips of, things that you have come across or just pointers that you might have for, what are some great ways to put some of those processes in place that really would allow a team to be sustainable in the long run?
Great question. Another thing that we struggle with as content team leaders. So in addition to what I talked about in terms of a process for content ideation and content requests, it can be a good idea to have a process by which you can understand workload. And if you use a tool like Asana, there are different functions you can visualize workload, and you can assign points per task. So you want to make sure that you're not overloading your people with too much work so that they're burning out and they hate their job. You also want to make sure you're not underloading them so that they're bored and they're watching the clock all day and they hate their job. You have to make sure that you're giving them the right amount of work. It's challenging, but they're not burned out. And you can do that by coming up with a model for an estimate of how long something should take. And you're not going to be, cracking a whip and like getting mad at people if they're not getting this done in exactly the right amount of time. This is like a framework, and it's really to help you plan. And I position it with my team as it's helping to make sure you have the right amount of work so that you're happy and engaged. And what I would do is I would sit down with each person on the team At my last role, I was managing not only editorial, but also video and graphic design and digital learning and things that I didn't have a lot of experience in. So for me with editorial, it's pretty easy for me to estimate how much time it's going to take to write an ebook or a video script, but it's less easy for me to understand what are all the moving pieces and the time investment to produce an animated explainer video. So I'm going to sit down with anyone who would be doing the work, and I'm going to ask them, what are all the moving pieces? I'm going to document that, and I'm going to understand how much time it would take to do if it was a 1-minute video or a 2-minute video. And I have built out calculators so I can very quickly understand how long something would take. And then when I'm assigning work, I'm going to understand how much resource or time a person has over a given week or a sprint or a month, depending on your company, and try to give them the right amount of work. I never assign somebody to 100% because there's always going to be those last minute things that come up in most fast moving companies. So I typically would assign like 50% capacity, and I would make room to accept those requests that would come in so that we can be agile and flexible and try to get somebody as close as possible to the right amount of work. And it's not a perfect science, but as long as you're showing that you're trying, usually that makes everybody happy.
Thank you. Guys, let's move to the content strategy. I believe we definitely should cover it. I saw that lots of your questions are more or less aligned with that question. But before we'll move forward, let me know where you're all coming from. Just type in the Zoom chat. I'm curious where you're tuning in. We have Europeans, yeah, Sweden, Belgium, Barcelona, Washington, Colorado, Texas, Houston, Greece, New York, India, Amsterdam, Canada. Cool. So we have a fantastic international audience today. And good old Budapest. Nice, nice. Thanks a lot for sharing. So we have a fantastic united community. And by the way, I mentioned in the beginning that we host these live episodes with top-notch experts for our Trenches community. If you are not a part of Trenches community, I will send you a link and you can join us. Let's move forward. I believe so. The next question basically is how to develop a good content strategy, right? Especially if your market is boring and conservative. Quite often I hear that question, right? I'm targeting engineers, like what I'm going to talk about, or a bunch of examples we can share here. So what would be your process?
So how to begin is even taking that whole boring thing off the table, because I don't think that's necessarily true. It might be boring to you. It's not boring to them. That's their profession. So it doesn't matter if you think it's boring necessarily, right? And there's always ways to inject fun, what you consider fun, on top of boring content that they consider interesting, right? Here's a simple example. I consider content as part of an event strategy, right? So content really serves the needs of the entire business. How can content help make an event more fun? Maybe in addition to creating the content for the event, sessions, maybe you also create commercials to play in between the sessions. Those are fun. You can have some fun there and some humor. Maybe you hire some DJ to spin tunes in between sessions so people aren't just looking at their screen. Maybe you have the content team create some relevant trivia that's fun for people. Doesn't really necessarily have to be your version of fun, right? It's a lot easier if you're creating content for people just like you. That gets easy, but that's not always the case. So taking that off the table in terms of a content strategy, gosh, I start by just asking a ton of questions. I have an intake form, and I want to get my hands on all of your most important documentation so I can understand who we're talking to and what we need to be communicating. So that is the first step, is really the research piece, and that takes a long time. So content strategy is not something you're going to whip out in a day, because usually it's going to take more than a day just to get your hands on all those pieces and read them and study up. And phase 2 is interviews, talking to people internally, lots of different people, talking to people all across the revenue team. So not just sales, but also product marketing and customer success, and if you have like sales ops and revenue ops and understanding how all these different systems work together, that's important. Because part of a content strategy is understanding how you're going to measure the results, not just what kind of content you're going to create, not just how are you going to repurpose and distribute it, but also how are you going to understand if you're successful. So it's really all about reading the documentation, studying up on the company by reading and asking questions, doing the market research and the competitor research if you're not super familiar in that space is also really important. Then phase 3 is when I start to look at the topics that are already trending or competitors are owning, and how can we not necessarily own those topics, but find a different way to speak about those topics to get attention, and starting to develop a strategy from there with those pillars and those topics. And essentially at the heart of any content strategy is how do you want to change people's minds or behavior? So I always come up with a theme for each company for the year. And the theme is really about that. How are we going to move them from point A to point B and change their minds or behaviors? And the whole content strategy is built from there.
And what you'll do if you'll join a company and they have produced already some content, right? They have a blog, and behind the scenes we chatted about this. The content strategy is not really good. First of all, I would love to ask you how can you figure out what are the red flags of bad content strategy, and how would you introduce these red flags to CMO, VP marketing, or CEO, depending on the organizational structure, right? And explain that you need to change the strategy and do it differently.
For me personally, red flags would be you're not seeing growth in branded search terms. People aren't searching for your brand. People aren't searching for your products. They're not hearing about you through content. Another red flag would be there's no growth in your high intent. If you're a sales-led company, there's no growth in your high intent lead mix, right? So you have your low intent leads. Those are people who you make them fill out a form to download your ebook, and then you put them into a cadence, and those are low intent leads. And then your high intent leads are people who hear about you and they raise their hand to speak with sales. If content's doing its job and the content strategy is functioning as it should, you should see a trend in high intent leads over time, especially as content starts to partner with the other teams and with demand gen and with, if you have an in-house SEO and you start to show results of content, you're able to influence the way that you're gating content. And when you start to influence those conversations and you start to gate more strategically, and your content is good and people are tilting their head and leaning in, what you're going to see as a natural consequence is an uptick in the high intent leads. And it does not happen overnight. So I'm not saying you should go back to your boss and say, take off all the gates off of our content. That's not great. Your sales team's probably going to be really pissed. But I would say the best thing you could do would be in the data. And if you're not a strong data person, that's okay. There's probably people in your company who are, and you can ask them to show you what you need to see and to set up dashboards for you so that you can start to understand which content is performing. For example, years back, we were putting a form in front of every single content piece, and people were downloading it like crazy. So marketing, we were meeting our goals. Content was the #1 lead type. We were doing so amazing, but those were converting to closed won at a really abysmal rate because people didn't necessarily want to buy, and we were calling them too soon because lead to speed is obviously such a huge thing, but it's not always the right thing. So really trying to show that data. Look what's happening. Now let's try something new and then let's see what happens. So you start to ungate certain pages and you start to see if that's impacting the business in the right way. And so it's just a matter of like slowly testing. And, a lot of companies are still getting their case studies. I would not do that. And I bet you, if you connect with the right person in the company, they will probably back you in saying that Removing the gates off your case studies is not going to hurt your sales team.
Love it. So the last question I want to cover, and then we'll cover the community questions, right? Let's pretend we have followed all the steps, right? We have a good content writer, a good content editor. So we just, again, decided to create a really good content strategy and produce the content the way it should be produced, right? Now we are dealing with the situation that nobody knows about us, right? And basically nobody is interested in our content. So we can't just publish it and then spread the word on company's Facebook page and LinkedIn page, because again, nobody will engage with it, right? And that's not the way to attract attention. So my question is, how would you attract attention to your content and using the content generate demand for your product? What would be your content distribution approach?
It really depends on the company. So I can't just give like one approach, like you should do A, you should do B. So a few things that you might be able to try depending on what your strategy is and your business model: vertical specific content. So perhaps you are not just like creating content about the industry or the larger space that everybody would be interested in. Maybe you are taking your software landing page and you're slicing and dicing it, and you're making 5 software landing pages specific to the 5 verticals that you serve. And then you're building out a content campaign specific to those people. Say I sell to content marketing managers, and I also sell to all these different people, but I sell to content marketing managers who work at B2B SaaS companies. I'm going to have a page just for them, and I'm going to have content about topics that they care about. And I'm going to start to build out more personalized content. There's a lot of paid tools that you can use in conjunction with content. For example, like LinkedIn conversation ads. That can be a nice way to distribute content, and it can be a nice way to re-engage with people who have already engaged with your content at one point, and then they kind of ghosted you and never came back. You might be able to follow up with them through LinkedIn, and you might use an educational content play rather than saying like, hey, do you want to request a demo? So many things you could do. You could, use content to create an experience for key accounts. So if you're selling a high ACV and you want to get decision makers, maybe they're not going to Google, they're not going to read a listicle, maybe they're too busy to even be on social because they're running these big global companies. But what if you invited them to this special event that was a VIP list, and there was a guest speaker that they actually cared about, and you were going to send them a gift to their house? The content team can help with all of that. The content team's going to write those outreach emails. The content team's going to write some copy for this letter that's going to come in the box with the gift. This is all ways that you can get the most value out of your content team. It's not always about writing listicles and SEO blogs. It really depends on your individual company.
Yeah, so basically you are talking about merging it with account-based marketing programs, right? And that's crucial in high CV space. One practical question, basically would love to hear your point of view. Would you insist on involving sales team into content distribution? I basically see the pros here, right? Because sales can use it as non-sales touch, but what are your thoughts?
That depends on your strategy. Do you have a sales team that has time to do that? The way your sales team is set up, they might not have time to be distributing content because they have to do X number of dials a day. And you have to be pretty influential to be able to influence your VP of sales or your chief revenue officer to try something new. So I don't know. It really depends. You have to make these decisions in collaboration with others. So it depends on your ability to influence and that person's ability to be open to taking risks and trying new things. Is it a bad idea? No. Is it necessary? Am I going to insist? No. There's definitely other ways that you can have a successful growing business without having the sales team do that, distribute content.
Cool. Thank you so much. So let's cover the community question. And probably the last thing, guys, you asked me if the episode is recorded. Of course, it's recorded because it's our Fullfunnel podcast. So I dropped the link to the audio. You can sign up, you can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or any other platform, or YouTube channel if you prefer video. So let's cover your questions. Caroline, would you like to join us? Unmute yourself and switch on your camera, please.
Sure. Hey, Erin. Hi. I had actually a few questions. So is there one particular one I should focus on, or just pick one?
Up to you.
Okay, so maybe we can get through some of them. So Erin, I find, and I don't know if you've experienced this, you probably have, but like VP level and C-suite folks often misunderstand like long form content's purpose and a content strategy. And they get kind of like hyper focused on, shouldn't it be like, really short, like a minute to 3 minutes or something like that, right? Or like where it's too complicated, or no one's ever going to read that long of content, even though Nielsen research shows time and again, nobody ever reads an article from beginning to end, right? There's different reading patterns. So how do you effectively set leaders straight and understanding the role of long form content, even long headlines, in a long-term topical authority building strategy?
That's a great question. So I think that the best way to speak to seniors is by using the language they understand, which is data and revenue.
Yeah.
So if you can find even 1 or 2 examples of long form content pieces that have resulted in leads, that have turned into SQOs, that have turned into revenue, and you can show them that, then they will believe you. And then it will be easier for you to do more of that if they're giving you a hard time.
Excellent. Excellent. Also, my company right now is wanting to invest in an SEO agency partner. And so far we've talked to like 5 or 6, and they're validating repeatedly the things our internal team have been saying, basically about our strategy. So, and content obviously is a key to any SEO strategy success, good quality content, right? And so that's there, but then when it comes down to the budget to hire the people to help produce that content and meet that need, we're like skimping. I'm getting a lot of like, oh, we can hire like a college intern or some like junior level person. And I'm like, what? I don't understand how you cannot see the mismatch here, right? Like, how do you deal with that?
I have dealt with that. Yes.
Yeah.
So I have seen, like a big $80,000 SEO contract. And it's like, well, what's my budget for freelance? And it's like, oh, you have $1,000 this month. I'm like, cool. That's like a blog, from somewhere like that.
Exactly.
So the same answer, I know it really sucks, but the answer is you're never going to get more budget if you don't show them data. And it's not even just the revenue data, it's the resourcing data. So for example, we have 2 writers on our team. Here is all the requests that are coming in from across the business. Here are the different teams that are requesting the most work. Here are how many hours each person has, and here's how full they are. So we need to have more budget for either a full-time hire, because I'm predicting that next quarter we will see this amount of requests or more because we're working on this key initiative, because we're going to have to create content for an event or for SCO or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And just really showing them how full your internal team is and showing them that the need for the budget has to come from somewhere. You're either going to do less work, and that's going to, potentially impact your results. And why would you spend so much money on an SEO agency if you can't execute with good content? That doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely. Okay. I think the last thing was something about, or 2 templates. You mentioned when you calculate costs. I've used in the past like a template from Gather Content, but it was really complicated. And I wondered if there was like some simple format that you use for calculating content cost and effort that you could share with us.
I made my own. I'm crazy. I like to make my own everything. I know this is just a a matter of me as a person. I like my own stuff, and I don't typically find that templates give me exactly what I need. So I did make my own. I also came from an agency where I worked within the one that they had, and I knew what worked and what didn't work. So when I was able to make my own, I did. And I've done that with content strategy and with other things. And again, iterative over time. What works at one company might not work for the next company. So I would just say, I could share a template, and I'm happy to, but it might not work. You might have to iterate on it so that it works for your particular needs, just like any other template anyone would ever share with you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Erin. That's all I got.
Thanks for great questions. Kelly, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I am relatively new at a company that has a history of producing a lot of content, and it's decent content and they rank well for things. So we're kind of at a good growth stage, not just starting out, but it's always kind of lacked strategy, and the content team is more of the reactive sort of responding to requests and a lot of random acts of content. That's why I'm here, is to drive towards strategy, priorities, making sure that the content that we're producing is actually laddering up to marketing goals. But it's a totally different culture versus the expectation that content is sort of like the on-demand producer of whatever else is happening with very little notice or planning. And so it's a cultural thing for sure, but I just wondered if that's something that you've navigated, and if you have any, guidance for sort of changing from that on-demand random acts to a broader, documented content strategy and really getting people on board.
I have. Yes, of course I have. That's such a common problem that I think most of us that have been doing this for even 5 years have probably ran into. I would say if you don't currently have a content strategy, but you want to start moving in the right direction, do you have a request form? So something simple. If you have, Asana, it could be an Asana form that feeds right into a board. If you have like a Google Sheet calendar, you could have a Google form that feeds right into a tab of your content calendar. And just make sure that you're asking people within that request to select which company goal this maps to. And that's a required question. And if they can't do that, or they select the one that says like other, then you need to talk to them. And maybe it is something that needs to get done that's outside of the company objectives. Like maybe they need the content team to help revise the company mission or values or whatnot. So like something like that isn't necessarily a bad ask. It's something important. But most of the time, if you start with that, you can start to direct people to like, I'm sorry, this will have to go on the backlog because we only have X amount of hours and X amount of resource. And we really need to focus on the requests that will move the needle, and just starting to get people to think that way.
Yeah, I love that. That's super helpful. Thank you. One other quick one is we're kind of a process averse group. I'm all for Asana, and I'm building out a lot of stuff there, and already do have forms and stuff that you mentioned, but I'm going to add your question because I love it. But a lot of people just aren't participating. Have you ever found any good ways to incentivize people to get on board with new process?
When you say not participating, they're just going outside of the process, so they
yeah, just like this still, I'm kind of like, if it's not in Asana, it doesn't exist, sort of, or, like trying to get people on board. But I'm new, so I don't quite have as much political capital to just shut it down. And there's just a lot of surprises that don't exist anywhere, or last minute stuff that shows up in Slack. And I'm just, it's just that kind of thing.
Yeah. For me, there's always a handful of people who get to skirt the process because of who they are in the company. Yeah. I'm not making my CEO fill out a form, for example. Yep. But the rest of the company, they have to follow the process. Otherwise, why do we have processes? If 98% of the people don't have to follow them, you're going to have a mess. And, it's a matter of, number one, telling them why, because we get so many requests every week that if you give me a request through Slack, I might get interrupted. I might have to hop on a meeting before I had a chance to add it to the calendar, and I forget, and your request never gets done. So by following this process, it benefits you. It's always like, what's in it for you? What's in it for the reader or the stakeholder? And that's number one. Number two is reminding people on a monthly cadence that you have these forms and these processes. So if you have a general Slack channel, or if you just have like a general email once a month, hey, everyone, sending this out for all the new joiners, just wanted everyone to know that we do have this form, we do have this process. Thank you. Let me know if you have any questions. And then number three, enforcing it. Every time somebody goes outside the process, even if you hate conflict, which I do, just a gentle reminder, by the way, you need to fill out this form. So-and-so told me that you went directly to them. All requests need to come through me via the form. Thank you. And before long, people they're not gonna, get that conversation too many times because they're gonna feel like a jerk.
Love it. Thanks for your help.
Thank you. Thank you. One thing from me, guys, if you don't mind, switch on your camera. I would love to take a group picture and share it as well on social media. That would be fantastic. We had a fantastic engagement, great questions. So I love our international community and definitely would love to tag all of you. And while you're switching on your camera, one quick question. How did you like the session? If you enjoyed it, if it was insightful, just share, thumbs up. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. That was brilliant. But because of our guest, Erin. Erin, thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks a lot for sharing your wisdom. I loved every single minute we spent together. And for you guys, as I mentioned, the episode, of course, was recorded. So I will send you an email with the links to our YouTube channel, Spotify, iTunes, upcoming Fullfunnel Summit, where Erin will be one of the speakers, link to join our Trenches community, right? And link to Erin's new website. If your company is looking for a fractional chief content officer, or you want to get an external advice, right? You know whom you should be reaching out. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Cheers.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.